Before we get rolling, though, I just want to thank everyone for joining. I know you have a lot of options in terms of how you use your day and what webinars you tune into. So I appreciate you taking the time to go through this info with us. As Bill mentioned, we're going to cover 5 things successful companies consider when evaluating HR software. I always like to spend a couple minutes at the front end of these calls just going over, giving a little context in terms of who I am, who Newcastle Research is, what we do. I promise it's not going to be a commercial of any kind, but it's always helpful, I think, to understand, particularly when there are recommendations or people are covering key considerations, key questions to ask, that type of thing. I know when I'm sitting in an audience, I always like to understand what the presenter's background is, to understand where the content came from. So this is kind of the who is Patrick and why should I trust anything he says portion of the program. So Newcastle Research is a completely independent research and consulting firm. If you boil it down to its essence, we help customers, as indicated on the slide, we help customers choose the best HR solution for their needs, right? So we advise would-be customers looking at, the list that we have here should not be interpreted as recommendations of any kind. This is just for illustrative purposes to give you an idea of who we cover, right? So we advise customers who would be choosing, platforms like this, HCM solutions like this. And that's actually a good segue. When I say HCM, human capital management, HRIS, HR technology, HCM, if you really, get into the weeds, those things can mean different things depending on who you're talking to. For the purpose of our presentation, these are essentially going to be synonymous, right? These are platform solutions that a company would use to manage, their HR, function soup to nuts, right? So our focus is on understanding the market, right? And so that's half the battle. So understanding, we sit in on demos regularly. We regularly talk to all the vendors that you see here and more. There are literally hundreds of options once you get going into choosing a solution for your company. But that's really half the battle, right? The other half of what we do is understanding the market and the customer. And what I mean by that, obviously, customers who choose to engage with Newcastle Research formally to help them choose a solution for their company. And typically, what that looks like is we help companies form a short list of vendors that make sense for them given their situation. So what I mean by focuses on understanding the market and the customer. We obviously have to understand the customers that we work with, but what I mean by that is understanding the customer in general, right? So what in the example that I give when I talk to people is you could have pick a vendor, ADP, Paycom, Paylocity, any Workday, any of these guys. You could have 2 companies or 2 customers at that vendor's user conference, for example, sitting at the lunch table, and one of them those 2 companies might look very similar, right? They might be the same size, they might be in the same industry, they might be in the same geography, right? On paper, they might look virtually identical. One of them might be in love with the solution that they're using, and one of them might hate it, right? And so, in a nutshell, that's my job. That's Newcastle Research's job, is to understand why that is. How could that be, right? And so a lot of it comes down to, there's a million variables that can go into that, and a lot of those are going to be covered today. So essentially, the recommendations, the considerations that I'm going to go over today are, which brings me to the next slide. What we're covering today. 5 things successful companies consider when evaluating HR software. So understanding how that can happen, right? Those 2, let's take that scenario that I just described, those 2 different companies at the lunch table. Understanding how one company could be really unhappy and another can be really happy, and they look identical on paper, it really, in a nutshell, is what we do. So it's understanding not just who they picked, but how did they get there, right? Because it's very easy to say, oh, well, we need a new HR, HCM, solution. Let's just ask another company that looks like us what they use, and we'll be happy as well. It sounds great, but it's amazing how often that fails. The better approach is to understand what questions did that company ask along the way? What things did they consider along the way to arrive at that successful solution? And that's what we're going to be covering today. And we're actually going to cover 6 things. I crossed out 5 and put 6. because top 5 is a lot more attractive in a title. That's part of the reason. The other reason is I added one at the last minute because a customer I was working with last week went through a situation I felt like it was really important to share with this group today. So without further ado, consideration number 1: what's the right HR technology vehicle for your needs? And by vehicle, I mean not the solution, like not the ADP or Workday or Oracle HCM or any of these guys, but the type of solution. HCM, PEO, professional employer organization, for those of you who aren't familiar, HRO, like a full, BPO, like an outsourcing. And I don't see this a lot. This is not too frequent, but it is so debilitating when I do see it that it's worth calling out as a consideration. So the imagery that you see here, I use car examples a lot because everyone can relate to buying, most people can relate to buying a car. So the 3 vehicles that we have up here, Tesla, I think that's a Ducati or a Land Rover, all fantastic vehicles, right? And on paper, designed to do similar things, right? You get on them and you take you from point A to point B. But really, they're designed to do very different things, right? The Tesla, electric vehicle, the Ducati made for going real fast, not something you would want in the snow. And the Range Rover, great off-road, not great if you're commuting 200 miles a day, right? So they're all designed to do very different things. Similarly, HCM, PEO, HRO, they're designed to do very different things. So what I tell customers, because oftentimes if a customer makes their way to Newcastle Research, it means they're not happy with what's going on today, right? No one just calls me and says, "Hey, Patrick, I just want to chat about how much we love vendor XYZ," right? So they make their way to me because they're not happy, right? And so part of my job is to understand where that went wrong. Like, why are they unhappy? But oftentimes, by the time they make their way to Newcastle Research, sometimes they've already started looking, right? So if you think of it on a spectrum, sometimes I'll get a call and they're at square one, or even earlier, they're at square zero. Like, all they know is they don't like what they're doing today and they need help. And on the other side of the spectrum, I do get calls at the 11th hour, right? So they tuned into a webinar like this and they say, "Well, we're about to sign on Friday with a new vendor. Let's call and just, are we making a mistake?" So typically it's somewhere in the middle, right? So they know they're unhappy. They've started to look, and oftentimes I call him Intern Timmy. Like, Intern Timmy raises his hand at the company and says, "You know what? This is exactly what we did 3 or 4 years ago, and we're miserable. Like, why are we doing the same thing and expecting different results? Let's get some help this time." And so I'll often get calls like that where they've already started to look at vendors. And sometimes they're looking at 3, completely different types of vehicles, right? And they feel like they're doing, I hate to phrase it so harshly, but they feel like they're doing a good job because they're looking at a bunch of things, right? And they are looking at a bunch of things. But it's important to narrow down the vehicle, right? So by all means, consider a PEO, consider HCM, consider a full outsourcing solution, HRO, BPO. But at the end of the day, narrow it down to a vehicle that makes sense for you, and then compare vehicles within that category. So if you get to the end of your decision, your end of your selection process, and you're still comparing 3 completely different kind of vehicles, then the search didn't reflect your needs, right? You hadn't appropriately captured the true needs of your organization. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. And the rest of the presentation is assuming that you are looking at an HCM solution, like the vendors we had on that on one of those front end slides. Like a solution like an ADP, Paycom, Workday, those guys, Paylocity, that your team is going to use. So the rest of the presentation is squarely focused on that. But as I said, this was important enough to cover because it can be really debilitating in a search process if you're still get it to the end and you have 3 different vehicles. All right, so that brings us to our first poll question. What is your biggest pain point today with your current HCM solution? I'll give you a minute to fill that out. We can talk about it. And as you're filling that out, I'll just talk to you. The reason we ask poll questions is because it's interesting, I think, for you, and we do the same thing, Newcastle Research, with surveys that we do. I try to make them as useful for you as they are for me. It's interesting for, I think, the people in attendance to see what others are, the pain points that other people are going through, but it also helps me tailor the talk to what people are going through.
You can see the results are starting to come back, Patrick.
Yep. Yeah, and this is interesting actually. Typically, I see dissatisfaction with customer service a little bit higher, but it's still on the board. But yeah, too many systems. I see that one a lot. A company might have grown. They need this for HR and payroll, and then they decide down the road, wow, we need, particularly in like COVID land, right? Now we need something for learning management, and they go pick a different vendor for that, and then they pick a different vendor for this, and all of a sudden 3, 4, or 5 years later, they're managing like 8 systems. I'm working with a customer actually right now. It's a national restaurant chain. They're based in Colorado, but oh my God, they're miserable because they literally have 10 different systems going on behind the scenes, and that's all they do is just manage systems. They don't have time to actually do their work. But so that's interesting. Thanks everyone for filling out the poll. All right, consideration number 2. Is this solution single HCM or integrated HCM? And so the first kind of public service announcement I'll make to people is be very aware that different vendors will define these things differently, right? And so if you're going through a vendor search and you're talking to 3, 4, 5 different vendors, whatever it is, don't assume that the terminology you hear on one demo or from one sales pitch, from one conversation with a sales team is the same definitions that the next one are using. Often it's very different. And often the definitions will be in line with what their strengths are, right? So no surprise there. So what I'll often hear is, a customer will say, "Oh no, we asked about that. We asked if it was a single HCM," and I'll hear, the sales team said, "Oh, it's completely integrated." So they haven't actually answered the question in the affirmative, but because of how they phrased it, the customer will think that they did. So anyway, that's just as an aside, a little public service announcement, as I said, that, be very careful how these are defined at different companies. So a single HCM, what is defined as built from the ground up on a single code base. So you'll often hear single code base, single database, meaning it's on the same set of code. The integrated HCM are applications that were built separately and then stitched together, right? So they could all be under one umbrella, meaning they could all be from one vendor, but that vendor might have acquired a solution. The example we just gave, and there's a lot of people on the phone here, or the Zoom call rather, who could probably attest to this and the pain points that come with it. If you're on multiple systems, that can run you into a host of different problems. But so sometimes it's the customer's choice to go with different solutions, and that's an integrated HCM. But sometimes you'll get one solution, quote unquote, from a vendor, and it's actually not a single HCM. It's not built on the same code base. It's integrated HCM, and as I mentioned, sometimes it's a result of acquisitions that vendor has made, and sometimes it's a result of partnerships, right? Third-party partnerships. The vendor might have HR and payroll in-house, maybe some talent management functionality, but maybe they don't have learning management. Maybe they don't have talent acquisition. And so they partner. Maybe they partner for time and attendance, for example. That's a pretty common one. So why does it matter? So all things being equal, a single HCM is where I tend to steer customers that I work with, because there's a whole host of benefits that come with that. And we'll talk about that throughout the presentation. And that's from the user experience. And I've listed just a couple of them here. Why does it matter? No need to manually enter and update data into separate systems. Single system requires one update, right? So there's a number of, I call it a ripple effect of benefits that come with a single system that transfer all the way to customer service, right? If you can imagine, you're calling up that vendor and you have a question on, HR and payroll, that in-house, customer service representative at the vendor might be able to handle those questions in their sleep. But if they partner for time and attendance, that's not really in their wheelhouse, right? And so you might not get as good an answer about time and attendance because the vendor that you're choosing to work with they partner for that one widget, that one module. And so they might not know it as well. And then they have to go, find the answer for you. And then you have that kindergarten game of telephone where the right answer doesn't make your way through, and customer service can be a nightmare. And so it's interesting when one of the first things I do when I talk to customers who come to us or make their way to us is I try to understand what their pain points are, right? So I can help them fix them. And sometimes it's customer service, right? It's like, oh, they don't have the answer to this, they don't have the answer to this. And it's interesting to kind of peel back the covers and educate, clients that I'm working with and say, well, this is why they don't know the answer. It's like, oh, okay. So you're right. They always have the answer for HR and payroll and some talent management, but they don't know what they're talking about with time and attendance. I'm like, well, that's because it's not their solution. And oftentimes, unfortunately, sometimes customers will not know that it's offered through a third party. They bought it thinking, because they bought it from one vendor, they bought it thinking that it's all their solution, and they weren't even aware that part of that solution is white labeled, for example. And so one of the things I talk about with customers is kind of a matrix of solutions, or a matrix of decisions that they have to make, and that's functionality, that's customer service, that's budget, right? It's everything and all the above. There's an infinite number of decisions that you have to make, along that process, or not an infinite number of decisions you have to make, but an infinite number of, variables that are at play. And so there is no one solution, right? And I talk to my customers about this a lot, because everyone, on some level, everyone wants the same thing, right? They want the best functionality, they want the best customer service, they want the best user experience, they want the best user interface, they want it to be modern, and they want the best price. And guess what, right? If it's the best of everything, it's going to be absolutely the most expensive thing out there, right? And if it's the cheapest thing out there, then something's got to give, right? And so it's a balance, right? And so I talk to my customers a lot about, like, you got to prioritize those things that you want. And this is the single database where, so there are no must-haves really at the end of the day. I mean, there are. I mean, in terms of like, okay, we have to have payroll, you have to have certain things, but in terms of like hard and fast, like must-haves, there are fewer than many people think. But this is one. And the example I give is, I live in New England. It snows here a lot. I have all-wheel drive. I don't have to have all-wheel drive, right? There are a lot of cars out on the road, around me that don't have all-wheel drive. But all-wheel drive is pretty close to a must-have for me, right? And so if I'm shopping for a car, I have to have a really, really good reason not to get all-wheel drive. Similarly, when I'm talking to customers, there better be a really, really good reason to justify not getting a single HCM because of the ripple effect that I just talked to. And again, I'm going to try to cover as much ground as I can, because I want this webinar to be really valuable for everyone. We could spend an hour just talking about this, because it's that important, but I'm going to move on. And that's a good segue. If anyone on the webinar today, if you have any questions if we don't get to your question in the Q&A section of the webinar, if you want to cover any of these topics in more detail, please reach out to me. I promise it won't be a sales pitch. I'm very easy to find. My contact information will be at the end of the deck, and I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. And it's interesting. I used to spend 30 seconds on the front end of webinars like this, inviting people to follow up, just like I just did, and trying to convince people that it won't be a sales pitch. And what I've learned, the people that do follow up with me, and it's not a sales pitch, and there's nothing I can do to convince you that it's not, if you don't want to believe that, but probably 90% of the conversations I have throughout the year are not revenue generating, but I like to talk to people anyway, because I always learn something. It's valuable for me to understand, like, who are you looking at? Like, why are you not happy with the solution you're using today? That's super valuable for me. So the conversations are always mutually beneficial. But actually, what I've learned, the reason that people are hesitant, to the extent that, because I always ask people when they call me up, I'm like, oh, were you hesitant to reach out? And they say, oh, yeah. The reason is not because they were afraid of walking into a sales pitch. The reason is because they were just bashful. Like, they thought they thought it was going to be a waste of my time. They were just bashful about kind of accepting free advice. But so don't, I love talking to people. So anyway, I got off on a tangent there, but if we don't, as I said, I'm going to try to move over a lot of topics to make it valuable. But if you want to go into more detail on any of them, please feel free to reach out. Consideration number 3, reselling scenarios. So the important lesson here is reselling scenarios can be beneficial or detrimental, right? And so two situations you want to avoid. Situation number one, and I actually referenced this on the single HCM slide. Situation number one is a customer buys a solution from a single provider and assumes it's a single system. And the reality is a core component is delivered through a third party. Could be delivered through a third party, or as I mentioned when we covered the single HCM, it could be a module that they acquire, right? So it could all be under the same umbrella, but it's on a separate code base, as I mentioned. And the result, and I guarantee, given the survey results on the first poll, how many people were on multiple systems, I guarantee a lot of you on the phone can attest to this. The customer experience is disconnected. The workflow, the user experience is negatively impacted by that. Support for that one module isn't as good as the other modules, right? So you have to actually hit a button to make one module talk to another. So there's a whole host of problems, as I said, that can impact everything from insecurity as well. Like there's a million different problems. So that's something to be aware of in the reseller. Understand when you're going into demos, when you're going into conversations with potential solutions that you're going to partner with. Understand what is in-house and what is not. Understand what has been acquired. Understand what that architecture looks like. What is being resold. But the other scenario is, and so a general rule might be, well, just avoid all reseller scenarios altogether. But actually, that's a scenario you want to avoid as well, because as I said, they can be beneficial. So situation number two that you want to avoid is the customer doesn't include any resellers in their search. And the quote I have here is, why would I buy from a reseller when I could buy directly from the software developer itself? The reason is, and so as a result, before I get to the reason, the result is the customer eliminates from consideration what could be a better option. So the reality is that there are times, and I make a point to not mention any vendors. I mean, I mentioned them, throughout the process, just in terms of the people that we cover, that type of thing. But I make a point not to cover any vendors when I'm talking about negatives or positives, that type of thing. I don't want to call anyone out on a public webinar like this. I'll do that if you call me up. But the reality is there are times when I will actually recommend to customers a reseller over the vendor that develops them themselves. Because if it's the same solution, and we'll talk about in the next slide, kind of how to suss out what the good scenarios are and what the bad ones are. But there are times when a reseller might have better customer service. And we'll talk about that later, Zach. So two situations, just understand what's being resold. That's the key takeaway. Understand the architecture, understand what's being resold, understand, what modules have been acquired. Avoid the ones that are kind of a Frankenstein approach behind the scenes, and don't necessarily rule resellers out. And we'll talk about that on the next slide in terms of how to kind of suss out those scenarios. So this is one of the considerations where it trickled onto two slides. So here's some key questions to ask to maximize your chance of success, to kind of suss out, as I said, the reselling relationships. So what exactly is being resold? So if it's a complete solution, that's not a deal breaker for me. That's not necessarily a red flag. If it's select modules to round out a core offering, proceed with caution. And we talked about that, on the earlier slides. If you're going with a vendor that has as a core competency, core solution, HR and payroll, maybe some talent management, but part of the solution is a third party delivering time and attendance, for example, that's going to be on multiple databases, right? That's going to impact your user experience. That's going to impact your workflow. That's going to impact customer service. And it might be that is your best option. I'm not suggesting rule them out. And I'll give you a perfect example. I was recently working with an architectural management firm in Texas, and they had a system, and I'll mention it because it's a good system. They were using Deltek for certain parts of their business, and it was very industry specific, and it made sense for them, right? But so that was tied to their payroll, and so my task working with them was to find everything but that, right? And so I needed to. They were going down the path of a multi-database solution. They were aware of it, and in that scenario, it made sense. But so these aren't, that's why I have the little caution symbol. it's not a kick out, but just be aware of the impact that that's going to have, as I said, because it's a balance, right? It's a matrix. So what is the underlying technology? Is it, as I said, a single HCM? Or is it an integrated, kind of something stitched together behind the scenes? Because keep in mind, just because it's a complete solution, being billed as a complete solution, doesn't necessarily mean it's a single HCM, because there are resellers who resell kind of a mishmash, Frankenstein set of solutions behind the scenes. And the third one is, why is it being resold? And this one's important. They're all important, but this is kind of one of those underappreciated, questions to ask. Is it a long-term strategy of both companies, or is it a stopgap? And there are examples all the time. Just within the past year, I can point to a couple. I won't mention them by name because, as I said, I don't like to call out negatives on a public call. But there are companies, for example, that will partner for a certain module, and that's great. They think that's a long-term solution, but then that third-party module gets acquired, and all of a sudden, the acquiring company is a direct competitor, and that all the customers that were using that solution, that HCM vendor with this third-party module, are now out of luck, because through no fault of their own, right, something happened behind the scenes in the M&A market that impacted that solution. So try to understand if it's just a stopgap, or do they have this, learning management or time and attendance or whatever it is today, because they're rolling out a new solution next year, and it's a stopgap until they do that. That's, just be aware, because if you sign up with them today, a year from now, when they roll out their new solution, it's going to be a green solution that no one untested, and there's going to be an entire learning curve. And so there's a bunch of variables to consider, but these are some questions to try to understand what you're getting into. And that's half the battle, is understanding what you're getting into before you sign the contract. Which brings us to a second poll question. What is your company using today for your HCM needs? I'll just keep an eye on the clock and make sure we're on track here.
And while folks are answering, Patrick, I will just remind folks that if you can't see the player in the Q&A box, our intrepid engineer, Ben, has put in a link that you can use to go to Pollevcom directly. So if you can't see the player, see the polling widget, then you can go directly to it on the URL that's on your screen.
Multiple HCM. Yeah, so that lines up with what we saw on the earlier poll in terms of the separate systems. Okay, that's good. Yeah, now that was, as I said, it's always interesting, I think, for the people in attendance to understand kind of what other people are dealing with as well. But it's valuable for me to understand who I'm talking to, so I can tailor the talk. And as I suspected, we don't have a lot of people on the call, apparently none, that are using the PEOs, which is great, because as I said, most of the talk is squarely focused on HCM systems. Consideration number 4, what is the implementation plan? As I said at the top of the call, my main job is to understand the companies that have a successful HR technology approach, strategy, rollout. How did they get there? It's not, as I said, it's more than just who are they using, right? Because as I said, you can have multiple customers using a solution that are quite happy. You could have multiple, customers using that exact same solution who can't run away fast enough. They hate it, right? And so my job is to understand why that is. And part of that is understanding where things went wrong. And so when I talk to customers, I always try to understand, like, why are you unhappy? What is the real reason you're unhappy? It might be, the symptom might be this, but what is the underlying cause of that pain? And when did it start? And oftentimes during those conversations, if I peel back the layers enough, it's interesting to see how often you can trace it all the way back to the implementation, right? So often I'll hear some version of the following. They'll say, the customer, will say, we were so excited. Like, we went through the search process and we were really happy with the pick and we were really excited. And then we got to the implementation and oh my God, everything just went off the rails and we couldn't, and oftentimes when that happens, the relationship never recovers. Right. So the implementation, and a lot of these are kind of self-evident, but it's amazing how often customers, will lose sight of these important things along the way. So even if you're not looking today, tuck these away 6 months from now, a year from now, 18 months from now. If you're looking, I promise you, if you pull this information out, keep my information, give me a call. I promise you, if you pay attention to these considerations, these questions, these things to watch out for, you are, I can't guarantee that you'll be happy, but you are significantly going to increase your chance of success. But anyway, back to the implementation plan. As I said, when things go wrong, you can often trace it back all the way to the implementation. So what to look for? There should be a detailed plan. And again, I work with a lot of customers, so I see the process, from behind the scenes. A trap, and it's kind of 50-50. Sometimes if to the extent the implementation goes poorly, sometimes it's the customer's fault and sometimes it's the vendor's fault. And often, most of the time it's a mix. But what I mean by that is often customers, and I'll try to warn the customers I work with that, your work isn't done, right? Because I get it. I really do. I talk to, HR, professionals. That's who I work with. HR professionals, CFOs, everyone in the selection committee. Finding a solution is not your job. Using the solution is your job. Finding the solution, that's my job, right? And so I do that every day, week in, week out. And so it's not the people I work with. Believe me, I understand your pain, because that's who I work with, every day. It's hard. You have a job to do, and now you're being asked to in addition to doing your job, you're having another job put on top of that you have to go find a solution. And so oftentimes when the solution is chosen, selection committees, HR directors, whoever it is, sometimes it's a one-man shop, sometimes it's a committee. They're like, they breathe a sigh of relief because they feel their work is done. Your work is not done. And I always encourage customers to recognize that your work is only half done. Half of the battle is picking the right solution, and the next half of the battle is getting that solution plugged in correctly, right? And there's a lot of work to be done. The vendor, so pay attention to that as a customer. That I could call that out as a consideration by itself. But what to look for in the implementation, as I said, because sometimes it's the vendor's fault. They haven't set you up for success. They should have a very detailed plan, right? So they should be able to tell you what resources you should expect to commit on the customer side in terms of time, in terms of staff. What is their responsibility? What is your responsibility as the customer? They should be able to detail, timelines, because at that point, they will know what your needs are. They will know what your must-haves are, your nice-to-haves are, what your time frame is. They should have a really detailed plan. If they don't, that proceed with caution. That's a red flag, because oftentimes, and I'll see this, where they'll say, we do this all the time. Don't worry, we got it. Right? So if you hear any version of, we'll figure it out when we get there, take a step back and say, no, we want details. We want to understand how many hours you're going to commit, how many hours we're going to commit. And that's actually a red flag as well. I recently worked with a customer who ran into a situation where the vendor had committed a certain number of hours to the implementation, and those hours ran out. And so the vendor said, we're done. You're on your own. And they're going to lose the deal, because of it. It's really not a very smart strategy playbook by the vendor, but that's what happened. Right. So understand what that plan looks like, because if the customer doesn't know what to expect during the implementation, it's a recipe for disaster. And I don't know what percentage, but conservatively, probably a third of customers that make their way to me who are unhappy and looking for a new solution, you can trace that relationship going off the rails all the way back to the implementation. So consideration number 5, this is the one I inserted because it's an important one. And I'm working with a customer right now who is which is why I put this in. So you get kind of bonus material today. Get buy-in early across the functional areas. I mean, on the customer side. And what I mean by buy-in is not buy-in on the solution, right? Because that's kind of the end of the selection process. What I'm talking about is getting buy-in on the fact that you need a new solution, for example. Get buy-in across the organization on the process to find a solution. So sometimes what I'll see, when and often it's HR, that is my main point of contact, someone in HR. And sometimes, sometimes the HR person will be like, oh no, we're running it, we're doing it, we're going to pick it. And then we'll get IT and, operations and so forth on board later on in the process. And I always coach them not to do that. Right? Because as I said, I have a front row view, a front row seat to why things went wrong and when things go wrong. And oftentimes things go wrong when you didn't get buy-in early, when a department didn't get buy-in early enough in the process. Because at that, once you get to stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 of the process, and you try to bring in IT, oftentimes they're mad. Right? They're like, why didn't you bring us in earlier? Like, you can't do this. You can't do this because we have this and this and this and these security issues and these security issues. Did you address this? And it creates this conflict. And it's not just IT and HR. It's operations and the customer I'm working with right now, where it's really a problem, is because they have an ERP element as well, and so they're across 30 countries, and so it's a very complex deal. But yeah, I can't stress that enough. Get everyone kind of virtually in the room and on board. And not everyone is going to play the same role in the process. Not everyone is going to spend as much time in the process. But it's important just to make sure that everyone feels included in the process, and not just for kind of a touchy-feely feelings aspect, but really just to make sure that everyone's aware of that they have a stake in it. And that I cannot tell you, I can't stress enough how far that goes in terms of making it an easy process. Okay, which brings us to our last poll question. What is the most important criteria in selecting your next HCM solution?
A few more choices this time, so we'll give people a second to fill out the responses.
Sure.
Fairly overwhelming so far. What do you think of that, Patrick?
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, they're still trickling in here. Every time I was going to comment, we get more results. So I'll wait another second.
It's become a dead heat. Actually, there are a few common answers. It looks like.
Yeah, and these it's interesting. It's always interesting to see, and I do it this way intentionally in terms of the order of the polls. It's always interesting to see because the first question I ask is like, why are you in pain? Essentially, I don't use those words, but like, why are you in pain? What's the problem? And then the last question is, what are you looking for in the next one? And it's always interesting to see when they line up and when they don't, right? Because earlier it's like if 100% people, 100% of the respondents say customer service is our number one problem, and then you get to the end and it's like 0% are looking at that for their next solution. This one actually lines up pretty well, I think. I think the customer service, the number one pain point, was a little higher in terms of what they're going with. But yeah, if we remember correctly, the overwhelming on the first poll, I believe, was number of systems.
Yeah,
and so the last one, consolidation, reducing the number of H systems and not of supplies, and then ease of use. As I mentioned a couple times over the course of the webinar, I often work with customers to kind of coach them to understand what's a symptom and what's the underlying issue. And so that ease of use, it's not a surprise to workflow, that type of thing, UI. It's not a surprise to see that that's a top of mind issue for so many people, because that is a symptom of having many systems underneath, right? And so yeah, no, that's always very interesting to see. So thanks everyone. That's the last poll. So thanks for everyone for filling that out. Okay, brings us to the last consideration, which is, what was originally consideration number 5, but because I added one, consideration number 6, customer service, right? How is the HCM provider's customer service? Typically, it wasn't on today's poll, which was a little unusual. As I mentioned, Newcastle Research does surveys sometimes as well, and that's typically number 1. It's usually right around 2 out of 3 customers cite poor customer service as the primary or one of the primary reasons that they're looking to leave an HCM vendor. But regardless of where it falls on your priority list of where your pain points are today, I think we can all agree that customer service is very important. And I always tell customers that, because oftentimes, as I said, if they make their way to me, they're unhappy. And what I tell them is, listen, things are going to go wrong, right? Regardless of who you pick, things are going to go wrong, right? And the same is true of a car, right? As I said, I use car analogies a lot because everyone can relate to that. Like, things are going to break in your car. The longer you own it, like, things are, the brakes are going to need to be replaced, whatever. So you're eventually going to need customer service, no matter who you go with as an HCM vendor. And so it's important to understand who has good customer service and who doesn't, which leads to the obvious and very difficult question: how do you evaluate customer service, right? And so, and I'll talk to customers. I just want to keep an eye on the time. I'll talk to customers about this who work with me, because oftentimes, as I said, typically it's higher that people are dissatisfied with customer service, and so oftentimes the initial conversation will be like, yeah, with the customer service is terrible, and then we start to work together, and we get a couple weeks down the road where we talk about what their must-haves are and their nice-to-haves, and oftentimes customer service is not on that list of what they're looking for. And I asked him, I said, well, 2 weeks ago you said customer service was one of your number 1 pain points, and it's not even on your list. And I kind of give them, I jokingly give them a hard time, and but I get it. I quickly let them off the hook, because it's a tough thing to quantify, right? If you have your budget, that's easily quantifiable, and even functionality to a certain extent is somewhat easy to quantify, right? We need learning management, we need time and attendance, we need advanced scheduling, we need HR, we need payroll, we need even geographies, like we need it to work in the UK and Australia and Canada and Japan, right? Like, can it do it or not? Customer service is tough, right? Like, how do you, because every single vendor that you talk to is going to tell you that customer service is their top priority, right? So how do you compare them, and how do you quantify that? They'll put CSAT metrics in front of you, customer satisfaction, net promoter score, CRE. There's a bunch of metrics that were really designed for vendors to rate themselves, but they are increasingly part of sales presentations, and they're important. I'm not suggesting to dismiss them entirely, but I always encourage customers to take a step back and recognize what they are, right? So somebody for example, a vendor puts a 95% customer satisfaction number in front of you as part of their sales presentation. Okay, that's great. 95% is a lot. That's super. Somebody else puts 93. Okay, so 95 is better than 93. That's great. But always take the time to understand, as I said, take a step back. What does that 95% number really mean? So they surveyed their customers. How many people filled out that survey, right? If they're lucky, maybe 30, 40%, right? So really what that 95% number is telling you is that 95% of the people who filled out the survey really like them. So it could be 95% of 20% of their customers, or 30%, or if they're, as I said, if they're lucky, 40% of their customers. What about the other 60% who didn't fill out the survey? Like, how did they feel, right? So the point I want to leave you with is be very skeptical of these customer satisfaction numbers, because they don't represent the entire customer base. And I know this, because this is part of what I do for a living, on the research side. Primarily what we do is on the consulting side, but we do research as well. I know the behind the scenes metrics. I know what they mean. I know the pitfalls. I know the pros and cons. It doesn't reflect the entire customer base. And I can tell you firsthand, because this is one of the elements that we do, is that portion that didn't fill out the survey is biased toward unhappy, right? Because a lot of times customers won't bother to fill out a survey. They just leave, right, if they're unhappy. So be aware of those, but which begs the question, okay, well, how do we evaluate customer service? And so I'll give you kind of this is probably the number one tip in terms of customer service. Look at their customer retention. That's going to be your best way to measure customer service. As I said, don't ignore the customer satisfaction, the net promoter score, the CRE, all the metrics that they're going to put in front of you, but look at customer retention. And it kind of makes sense, right? Intuitively, customers vote with their dollars, right? And so, to use a car analogy again, if your neighbor across the street is on their fourth, Honda Accord or fourth Toyota Camry or whatever it is, fourth, Ford F-150, you don't need to ask them if they like Ford F-150s. It's their fourth one, right? Just because they keep buying them, so they like them, right? So it makes sense. Customers vote with their dollars. That's going to be your number one kind of proxy to evaluate customer service. Retention is the number one goal for SaaS HCM providers. Like they're going to tell you that, our number one goal is, to change our customers' lives, whatever it is. And that's fine, but really, if and this is true of any company with a recurring revenue stream, whether it's Netflix selling you movies or an HCM vendor selling you, the HCM, solution and the accompanying, service that goes with it. If it's a recurring revenue stream, in other words, a subscription, their number one goal is to keep you, right? And that's fine. This is one of those scenarios where your goal is completely in line with theirs, right? They want to keep you as a customer, and you don't want to do another search 6 months from now. Like you want to be happy, right? You want them, you want to keep paying them, right? Because that means you're happy. So anyone with a recurring revenue model, retention is their number one goal, right? So rate them on that, right? So customer retention. So, okay, begs the follow-up question. Just taking a quick look at the time. What's a good number, right? What should we look for, Patrick? So this stoplight is something I often put in front of customers, and it's a pretty good rule of thumb. If there are less than, so most, you think of it like a bell curve, most of these HCM vendors out there are going to be in that 90 to 94% customer retention. And I always have to coach, customers to kind of reevaluate, reconsider the academic scale that we all grew up with, where they're like, oh, 92%, that's an A-. That's super. That's well above average. It's not, right? So average is 90 to 94%. So that A- territory is actually average in this context. Because as a vendor, if you're only keeping, on average, to use the academic scale, if you're only keeping 75%, you're not going to stay in business very long, right? So average is 90 to 94%. So this is kind of the scale. And think of it like a bell curve. Most of them are going to be in that 90 to 94% territory. If you're at 94% or above 94%, you're in really elite territory. There are very few HCM vendors that have customer retention that high. And similarly, there are very few that have it below 90%. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are a few. There are a number that do, but I always look into why that is. For example, there are a number of companies that have retention below 90%, but sometimes that's skewed because they're squarely focused on the SMB market, right? So small medium businesses. So a lot of, statistically speaking, a lot of SMB, a lot of startups fail. So most of, in terms of sheer numbers, most of the companies that go out of business are smaller businesses, right? And so if you, as an HCM vendor, are squarely focused on that SMB market, your retention numbers are going to be skewed by that. So it's always helpful to understand, context. But as I said, this is a general rule of thumb. If somebody's below 90%, proceed with caution, understand why that is, understand what's going on. It begs further questions. Other considerations. Oh yeah. Customer retention versus revenue retention. Oftentimes you will ask a vendor for customer retention and they will give you a revenue retention number, and that's fine. I'll kind of give you some quick and dirty math to understand the difference. If an HCM vendor has 10 customers, just to keep the math simple, at the beginning of the year, they have 10 customers. And of those 10, 9 of them are still there at the end of the year. They may have added 2 or 3 new customers, but those are disregarded for the calculation. Of the 10 that are there at the beginning of the year on January 1st, if their fiscal, is in line with the calendar year, 9 of them are still there. That's 90% customer retention. 9 out of 10 makes sense. But if that one customer that left was a huge customer in terms of revenue, represented 50% of their revenue, although their customer retention is 90%, their revenue retention would only be 50% because that one customer that left was so big, it represented half of their revenue. The reason I tell customers, you might ask for customer retention, they might give you revenue retention. That's fine, because as you grow as an HCM vendor, as you get hundreds and thousands of customers, those two numbers mathematically start to look a lot alike. So don't be alarmed if they don't give you that exact number. Do be alarmed if they don't disclose it, and that's a red flag. And there are a number of vendors out there. I would say probably 50% to probably 2/3, closer to 2/3 of vendors out there will disclose this number. But there are some that don't. And I encourage, because I have conversations, as I said, I sit through demos, I have relationships, informational relationships with all these vendors, because I need to understand what their roadmap is, what's going on behind the scenes, what are they excited about. I sit through demos, and I have conversations with their senior executive team. And any vendor out there that doesn't disclose this number, I always give them a hard time, because they're basically advertising or telling the market that, we try to keep customers, but we're not going to tell you how successful we are at doing that. Be very wary of that. If they choose not to disclose it, generally speaking, there might be a reason. So yeah, I always like transparency. And the last point I'll make on the definitions, or on the other considerations as it relates to customer service, is the definitions. Similar to integrated and single HCM, oftentimes vendors will define things as it helps them. And I'll give you an example. There's one vendor out there, and I actually worked with a couple of customers. The reason I found out about it was I was working with a couple of customers, and then a month later, each of them called me and said, "Hey, you told us these guys were 92%, retention, but they just told us they're 97%. What's the story?" And I was like, "I don't know. That's not correct." And so I actually called the vendor's CFO and I said, "What's going on here? Like, you guys, it was a publicly traded company." I said, "You guys are 92%. That's in your 10K. Like, 2 of my customers in the last month just sat through a demo in which they were told that you guys have 97% retention." He's like, "I have no idea what that number is. Let me look into it." So he called me back a couple of days later and he said, "Yeah," kind of sheepishly. He said, "What our marketing team did was they excluded things that they deemed beyond their control, meaning like mergers and acquisitions, that type of thing." And I was like, "That's not," and he's like, "I know." And so anyway, just be aware. And I'll be candid, not at the risk of sounding like an advertisement or a commercial. You can have a really tough time kind of sussing that kind of thing out without someone like me in your corner. But do what you can. Like, go through, if you choose not to engage with someone like me, if to the extent they're publicly traded, go through their 10K, go through the annual report, educate yourself on. Don't just take what the sales team is telling you at face value, because it's not often in line with reality. Most people are pretty good. Most sales teams, marketing teams are pretty good, but sometimes they'll try to bend the truth a little bit. This is our last slide, just the last thing, just to circle back on the importance of that, the number of code bases, the architecture underneath covers, really strong relationship. So what I did was I looked, just to give you kind of an overview of what you're looking at here. What I did was I took the vendors, and this isn't all of them in the universe, because, as I said, not all of them disclose their revenue retention. But to the extent that I had visibility into vendors' revenue retention, and to the extent that I had visibility into the number of code bases, I just did a correlation. And it's not an accident. As you could see, the fewer code bases, the simpler the architecture behind the scenes, the higher the revenue retention, right? And so all that flow, that ripple effect that I talked about, the simpler the architecture, which makes sense, right? If you have fewer things behind the scenes, like, if you go through acquisitions as a vendor, if you go through acquisitions and you're trying to stitch together behind the scenes a recent acquisition, or making sure that something with a third party partner is working correctly. Every dollar that you spend kind of babysitting that behind the scenes is a dollar that you're not spending on customer service, for example, right? And so it makes sense, behind the scenes, but just another proof point to kind of bring it full circle of how important that architecture is behind the scenes. But I know we're running out of time. Anyone have any questions?
Yeah, there's just a couple of minutes left, folks. If you want to use the question and answer box below the viewer, you can send in a question for Patrick. I also will offer a comment, Patrick, from Kathy in the audience that says, "This is fascinating. We had a failed implementation because it looked easy to use, but was not functional in the long run," going back, I think, to that last poll question.
Oh, yeah, it's a great point. And before, if there are any questions, and again, I apologize. We always go up, and I don't leave a lot of time for questions because I do try to make this as valuable as I can. But Kathy's point, remember that these demos, these sales teams, and as I said, most of them are really good people. Like you find in the grocery store or on the highway, like most people around are good, but their job is to make that thing look good. They drive that demo every day of the year, right? And so they're really good at making it look great, right? And so try to trip them up. That would be another suggestion I would have during the demo, is stop them and say, "Hey, can you show us what happens if you do this?" Like, ask questions, stop them along the way. If they show you a report, don't just ask for the report output. Say, "Show me how to build that report." That type of thing. So always try to trip them up, take them off their kind of beaten path, if you will. But no, that's a great comment, Kathy.
Maybe just time for one question, I think. What are the pros and cons of a smaller versus a larger HCM vendor, do you think, Patrick, if you had to sum it up briefly?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Generally speaking, and again, it's always tough to answer generally speaking, but generally speaking, with a smaller vendor, you might get better customer service, right? Because they're more nimble. They might have smaller teams, might have higher retention rate with their own customers. Typically, with a larger vendor, the pro with them is tremendous R&D, right? And so they're always spending. But as you get to be, 10, 20, 30, 50,000 employees, sometimes customer service can suffer, right? And so there's pros and cons. But sometimes you can find the best of both worlds, right? And I mentioned this on the reseller slide. Sometimes you can get a small company that sells a larger company's technology, so you get kind of the high end R&D with the high end customer service as well. So it's a matrix of decisions, but generally speaking, that's kind of what you see from the smaller and larger vendors. Customer service, R&D. That's kind of the calculus.
Fair enough. Folks, I know that we are out of time, but if you have more questions for Patrick, his email address is right on your screen. You can email him, and with that, I'm sure he'd be delighted to follow up with more questions. Patrick, Thank you for a comprehensive, but also really practical presentation on how to think about HCM vendors and some easy steps. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks everyone for joining.
Just a reminder to HCI members, today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit, as well as for HCI recertification. Your credits for attending this webcast will appear soon on your My HCI profile under the transcript tab. Transcripts may take you up to about 24 hours to update. While you're there, don't forget to check out hci.org for even more insights, as well as information on our certifications and events. I'd like to say one more thank you to our presenter today, Patrick Sayers, president of Newcastle Research, and to the good people at PayPro for making this event possible. I'd also like to thank you, our webcast viewer, for spending an hour with us today. We'll see you next time.